Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a text that it doesn't just suggest minor adjustments to Christian sexual ethics.
No, not at all.
It argues for a complete theological revolution. It takes us right to the foundation and asks a genuinely radical question for the church. What happens when theology takes pleasure, or lust, as the original German text calls it, this, broader concept of desire? What happens when theology takes that seriously?
And not just seriously, but...
Right, not as a danger, not as something to be managed and feared, but as a foundational source of power.
a source of power for love, for dignity, and for faith itself. That is the uncompromising core premise of the work we're analyzing today.
And that work is Dialog zur Lust am Göttlichen.
Which translates roughly to a dialogue on the divine desire, or even divine lust. And the subtitle is just as important.
Das weiße Tuch der queeren Theologie.
The white cloth of queer theology. And it's structured explicitly as a crucial, frequently asked questions handbook, an FAQ.
Which is such an interesting format. It's not a dense academic paper. It's practical. It's saying, here are your questions, here are our answers.
Exactly. The author, Eureka Circe, isn't just trying to offer another treatise. The mission here is to synthesize arguments to create a definitive theological handbook.
One that directly and systematically addresses the most fundamental, the most challenging questions about church sexual morality.
Yeah, and we're not just looking at one viewpoint here. You can see how deep theological analysis, biblical interpretation, and feminist perspectives are all meticulously woven together.
They create a single, unified system.
It's what Circe characterizes as a Christological and sensitive theology.
Okay, let's break that down. Christological.
Meaning it's rooted in the life and person of Christ. It's not just abstract philosophy, but then there's the sensitive part.
Acutely aware of human vulnerability, of experience.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's designed to guide the reader through the systematic consequences of this ethical shift over a structured period. The text even refers to it metaphorically.
As a journey over 3 times 7 days.
Right. It's a process. It's intended to facilitate nothing less than a complete theological reorientation for the institution and for the individual.
So the mission is massive. And the conflict it's addressing is, it's clear from the very first page.
Oh, it's unavoidable.
The text explicitly targets what it calls the cleft.
The chasm. The gaping divide.
Between official institutional church doctrine and teaching on one side.
And what they call gelebte Realität on the other.
The actual, messy, beautiful, lived reality of the faithful. This text is saying loud and clear, we can no longer tolerate this.
We can't have a situation where institutional law just ignores the lives being lived by the very people it's supposed to serve.
And if we recognize that demand, that urgency to bridge the gap between doctrine and lived reality,
then you see the engine. That becomes the entire engine driving the book's theological system. It's a promise of new pathways, for pastoral practice, for sweeping church reform.
But, and this is the key, right? It insists those pathways only become visible once you do the foundational work.
Yes. Once the traditional doctrines, which the text argues have been built upon law and fear, are systematically replaced.
Replaced by an ethic focused on grace and relationship.
It's a fundamental architectural shift. You're not just repainting the walls. You're knocking down the foundation and building something new.
That sets the stage perfectly for the foundational shift in Section 2. Because before it touches any specific issue, any hot-button topic, the dialogue completely re-architects the relationship between spiritual life and sexuality. You mentioned it moves away from law and fear gazettes and angst and anchors itself instead in freedom and relationship, Freiheit and Beziehung. What does that shift mean in practice for you, for the faithful?
That foundational move is, it's everything. The traditional theological model so often approaches sexual ethics primarily through prohibition.
A list of don'ts.
Exactly. What you must not do. It's about control. And it relies on fear of spiritual consequence, fear of institutional punishment. And that approach fundamentally restricts freedom.
It's a negative framework.
It is. The system proposed by queer theology here insists that a genuine Christian ethic cannot be negative. It has to be generative. It must be defined by relational responsibility, which requires 2 things.
Okay.
First, the freedom that is granted by grace, and second, the ethical structure of relationship.
And what does that mean, the structure of relationship?
It means the central question is no longer, did I break a rule? The central question becomes, how am I treating the other person? Am I honoring their dignity? It's about the relationship, not just adherence to some external abstract law.
So we're replacing the checklist of prohibitions with a framework of positive ethical engagement.
We are. And the text defines this new engagement with three core non-negotiable characteristics. Any legitimate modern sexual ethic has to have these three things.
Right, what are they?
First, it must be human-centered or menschenzentriert. Second, pleasure-friendly, lustfreundlich. And third, life-affirming, lebensbejahend.
That trifecta, I mean, it sounds entirely logical, doesn't it? But you put that in a historical church context, and it's truly radical.
It's revolutionary. It really is. Because it redefines the role of the human subject in theology.
How so?
Well, when an ethic is human-centered, it means the lived experience, the dignity, the integrity of the person, and all their diversity that can't be sacrificed for the sake of an abstract law. The person comes first.
And pleasure-friendly.
That means recognizing that desire or lust isn't a defect. It's not a sign of the fall. It's a positive, God-given force.
Which leads to the third one, being life-affirming.
Which means it has to embrace the entirety of human existence. It has to refuse to categorize huge segments of human love or identity as inherently flawed or disordered.
Let's focus on that term lust, because historically, it has been treated as a theological liability, right? A sign of our fallen nature, a weakness to be overcome.
Absolutely, a danger.
But this text reclaims it entirely. It views desire, pleasure, not as a hazard to be managed, but as a source of strength, a craft cal. How can something traditionally associated with sin be re-engineered into a spiritual power source?
This is the critical piece of theological innovation in the book. By calling it a source of strength, the text is positing that the energy of desire, that deep human yearning for connection, for intimacy, for vitality, is actually essential.
Essential for what?
For generating genuine, sacrificing love, for maintaining personal dignity, and, crucially, for deepening one's faith.
So a faith that denies or fears the body's energy is what? A weaker faith?
A diminished faith, yes. The argument is that when desire is channeled ethically within a responsible relationship, it becomes a powerful affirmation of the abundant goodness of creation. It's a taste of the divine.
But I imagine the immediate counterargument from a traditional perspective is that this just sounds like a free pass for hedonism.
Of course.
You know, a complete abandonment of traditional boundaries. How does the text explicitly defend this position against charges of, say, theological relativism, or of just abandoning Scripture altogether?
That's a necessary challenge, and the text addresses it directly. It doesn't throw out tradition. It demands a biblical rereading, a biblische Neulesen.
A fresh look.
A fresh and more honest look. It argues that this new ethic can't just be an abandonment of tradition for modernity's sake. It has to be demonstrably true to the gospel, dem Evangelium true bleibt, while also respecting the lived experience of the faithful.
So how does that rereading work? What does it focus on?
It focuses on the core message of the gospel, things like love, grace, radical inclusion, relational justice, over the legalistic proof texts that are so often ripped from their historical and cultural context.
So it's the spirit of the law over the letter of the law.
That's a great way to put it. The mechanism isn't throwing out the Bible. It's arguing that the traditional interpretation was faulty because it prioritized fear and law over the central Christian message of grace.
And this leads us to what feels like the ultimate theological validation point for the entire system.
The keystone.
The doctrine of incarnation and embodiment. The text argues that the church has to understand human diversity, sexual, gender, relational, as an absolute inherent gift from God.
Built into the very fabric of creation, yes.
So what is the specific function of incarnation here? How does that doctrine do the work?
The incarnation, the belief that God took on human flesh in Jesus, serves as the ultimate theological stamp of approval for the physical world and the human body.
It makes the body sacred.
It does. The text demands that the church respects incarnation, bodily and physically incarnation lively respected. This is the key lever. If the divine chose to manifest fully within the diversity and complexity of human embodiment, then the body in all its forms, its desires, its expressions of love, is inherently holy.
So you can't play them against one another.
You cannot play faith, body, and love against each other. That makes the stakes very clear. If you accept the incarnation, you are implicitly validating that connection. To deny the validity of a person's embodied identity or their ethical desire is, in this framework, to deny the incarnation itself.
And that radically shifts the perception of sin, doesn't it?
Completely. Sin is no longer primarily located in the body or in desire itself. Sin is found in the abuse of power, in the failure of relational responsibility, in the imposition of fear and control over the lives of others,
So we move from a theology where the body is suspect and needs to be policed.
to a theology of affirmation, where the body is the very locus, the very place of divine respect and connection. This whole system, resting on freedom and relationship and validated by embodiment, now gives us the tools to address the systematic fields of integration.
Having established that incredibly strong framework where the body is respected and freedom governs the ethic, we now move into those systematic fields. The first major area of concern is creation, order, and diversity. The idea of Schöpfungsvielfalt.
And this is where the critique moves from personal ethics to cosmology and to church governance. Historically, traditional church law and doctrine have relied, really foundationally, on the concept of the order of creation.
The Schöpfungsordnung.
Right. This prescribed a singular, fixed, often hierarchical, and very strictly defined structure for human life and relationships.
And that was centered almost exclusively on procreative heterosexual marriage.
That was seen as the only ordered form. But the text argues that this entire framework tilts or collapses. The German is kipped under the weight of reality.
The weight of biological reality, human experience, and deeper theological insight.
All of it. And it must, the text says, necessarily shift toward the principle of creation diversity. Schöpfungsvielfalt.
The implications of that shift are profound, especially for church law, for Kirchenrecht.
Oh, they're massive. If theology accepts that creation is not a rigid, singular blueprint, but is fundamentally defined by inherent variety,
That God intentionally created diversity in biology, in identity, and expression.
then the rigidity of previous laws based on that singular monolithic order loses its entire theological foundation. It's built on sand.
So the text is saying that the existence of diversity is not a theological problem to be solved.
Exactly. It's proof that the fixed, singular rule was never the divine intent in the first place.
That is a brilliant rhetorical move. It just flips the whole thing. It shifts the burden of proof entirely.
It does. It is no longer up to the marginalized person to prove why their identity is acceptable. It's now up to the institution to explain why its narrow interpretation of a fixed order has so spectacularly failed to reflect the reality of God's varied creation.
What does this mean for specific laws then? Say, those laws that pertain to sexual difference.
It means that laws that assume a strict, fixed, binary male-female, procreative, non-procreative as the only legitimate form of relationship are, well, they're automatically rendered obsolete.
Because they're based on a false premise.
A false premise about the nature of creation itself. If variety is inherent to the divine gift of creation, then laws designed to enforce uniformity are operating outside the will of the Creator. Church law must become elastic and expansive enough to accommodate the full spectrum of creation diversity.
Okay, so moving from that macro concept of creation diversity, the dialogue then cycles back to the micro level.
Yeah.
It comes back to individual spiritual experience.
Yeah.
The integration of desire and grace lust in Gnade. This integration feels crucial because it's where the personal and the divine actually meet.
It is the heart of the personal theology. The book is promoting a dialogue that is specifically aimed at liberation.
Liberation for whom?
For those who, as the book says, no longer want to play faith, body, and love against each other. They want an integrated spiritual life. They're tired of being told their bodies are bad or their love is wrong.
And the systematic integration argues that desire, lust, is not just some obstacle to grace, Gnade, but can actually be systematically linked to it.
Yes, that they can exist in harmony.
But let's challenge that for a moment. If we accept desire as a source of strength, how does the text differentiate between desire that leads to love and ethical connection, and desire that leads to, say, self-serving excess or even exploitation?
A very important question.
How they manage the theological difference between lust as this positive desire and gear, which is just greed.
This is where the emphasis on relationship comes back into play. That becomes the ethical filter. The text is very clear. Desire as a divine gift is affirmed only when it is ethically oriented toward love, dignity, and relational responsibility.
So it's not all desire is good.
No, it's that desire is a good energy that must be directed ethically. Grace is defined as the transformative, unmerited favor of God. If the human body is respected as the locus of incarnation, then desires arising from that embodied existence cannot be inherently opposed to grace.
So when it's expressed well.
When desire is expressed in a way that respects the freedom and dignity of the other person, it becomes a way of experiencing and manifesting divine connection. It becomes a grace-filled connection.
In other words, the ethical line isn't about what you desire, but how you act on that desire.
Mhm.
It's about whether that action affirms or diminishes the other person's dignity.
Exactly. The shift is from a morality of forbidden acts